Running a feeder through another tenant's basement in a residential duplex violates the National Electrical Code. NEC Section 210.10b states that feeders shall be run to a readily accessible location nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors. This means the feeder should be easily reachable and as close as possible to where the main electrical service enters the building. The purpose of this rule is to ensure that electrical equipment can be safely and quickly accessed for maintenance, repairs, or in case of an emergency. Running the feeder through another tenant's basement makes it less accessible and potentially creates a hazard if the other tenant obstructs or modifies the wiring. Furthermore, NEC Section 210.23d states that feeder shall not be installed in spaces used for environmental air handling. Basements are often used for environmental air handling, meaning they may contain 8-track equipment or ductwork that circulates air throughout the building. Installing a feeder in such a space could expose the wiring to damaging conditions such as moisture or temperature fluctuations, and could also create a fire hazard if the wiring insulation deteriorates. The correct way to install the feeder would be to run it from the service disconnect to a readily accessible location, such as a panel board or meter box, in each unit. This ensures that each tenant has their own electrical panel that is easily accessible and meets code requirements. The feeder must be sized appropriately for the load it will serve, taking into account the demand factors specified in the NEC. Overcurrent protection must be provided at the source of the feeder, typically at the service disconnect, to protect against overloads and short circuits. The feeder conductors must be installed in a raceway or cable assembly that is suitable for the environment in which they are installed. For example, if the feeder is run underground, it must be installed in a waterproof conduit or direct burial cable. The feeder must be properly grounded and bonded to ensure that any fault current can safely return to the source. Grounding and bonding connections must be made in accordance with the NEC. The feeder must be installed in a neat and workmanlike manner. All connections must be properly tightened and insulated, and the wiring must be supported to prevent damage. The installation must be inspected by a qualified electrical inspector to ensure that it meets all applicable codes and standards. To further elaborate on the requirements of NEC Section 210.10b, the term readily accessible means capable of being reached quickly for operation, renewal, or inspections, without requiring those to whom ready access is requisite to climb over or remove obstacles or to resort to portable ladders, and so forth. The phrase nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors means that the feeder should be run as directly as possible from the service disconnect to the panel board or meter box in each unit, without unnecessary bends or detours. The intent is to minimize the length of the feeder and reduce the voltage drop. To further elaborate on the requirements of NEC Section 210.23d, the term environmental air handling space means any space used for the movement of environmental air, including plenums, ducts, and other spaces used for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. The intent of this rule is to prevent the installation of electrical wiring in areas where it could be exposed to damaging conditions or create a fire hazard. The type of wiring method used for the feeder must be appropriate for the environment in which it is installed. For example, if the feeder is run in a damp or wet location, it must be installed in a waterproof conduit or cable assembly. If the feeder is run in a hazardous location, it must be installed in a conduit system that is approved for use in that location. The size of the feeder conductors must be adequate to carry the load that it will serve. The NEC provides tables that specify the minimum size of conductors required for different ampacities. The feeder conductors must be protected by an overcurrent device, such as a circuit breaker or fuse, that is sized appropriately for the ampacity of the conductors. The overcurrent device must be located at the source of the feeder, typically at the service disconnect. The feeder must be properly grounded and bonded to ensure that any fault current can safely return to the source. Grounding and bonding connections must be made in accordance with the NEC. The feeder must be installed in a neat and workmanlike manner. All connections must be properly tightened and insulated, and the wiring must be supported to prevent damage. The installation must be inspected by a qualified electrical inspector to ensure that it meets all applicable codes and standards. In addition to the specific requirements of NEC sections 210.10b and 210.23d, there are other general requirements that apply to the installation of feeders. These include, but are not limited to, the following. Firstly, the feeder must be installed in accordance with all applicable local codes and ordinances. Secondly, the feeder must be installed in a safe and workmanlike manner. Thirdly, the feeder must be properly supported and protected from damage. Fourthly, the feeder must be properly labeled and identified. Fifthly, the feeder must be inspected by a qualified electrical inspector before it is put into service. To summarize, running a feeder through another tenant's basement in a residential duplex is a violation of the National Electrical Code. The correct way to install the feeder would be to run it from the service disconnect to a readily accessible location, such as a panel board or meter box, in each unit. The feeder must be sized appropriately for the load it will serve, protected by an overcurrent device, properly grounded and bonded, and installed in a neat and workmanlike manner. The installation must be inspected by a qualified electrical inspector to ensure that it meets all applicable codes and standards. Furthermore, the NEC provides specific requirements for the type of wiring method used, the size of the conductors, and the overcurrent protection device. These requirements are designed to ensure that the feeder is installed safely and reliably. Failure to comply with the NEC can result in fines, penalties, and even legal action. It can also create a safety hazard for the tenants of the building. Therefore, it is essential to consult with a qualified electrical contractor to ensure that the feeder is installed in accordance with all applicable codes and standards. The electrical contractor will be able to assess the specific conditions of the building and recommend the best way to install the feeder. They will also be able to obtain the necessary permits and inspections. Remember that electrical work can be dangerous, and it should only be performed by qualified professionals. Attempting to install a feeder yourself could result in serious injury or even death. If you are not a qualified electrician, it is best to leave the work to the professionals. In addition to the NEC, there may be other local codes and ordinances that apply to the installation of feeders. It is important to check with your local building department to determine what requirements apply in your area. The building department will also be able to provide you with a list of qualified electrical contractors in your area. When selecting an electrical contractor, be sure to choose one that is licensed, insured, and experienced in installing feeders in residential duplexes. Ask for references and check them carefully. It is also a good idea to get several bids from different contractors before making a decision. Once you have selected an electrical contractor, be sure to get a written contract that specifies the scope of the work, the materials to be used, and the price. The contract should also include a provision for payment and a schedule for completion of the work. Before work begins, be sure to obtain all necessary permits from the building department. The electrical contractor will typically handle this process for you. Once the work is complete, the electrical inspector will inspect the installation to ensure that it meets all applicable codes and standards. If the installation passes inspection, the inspector will issue a certificate of occupancy. The certificate of occupancy is required before the building can be occupied. Running a feeder through another tenant's basement is not only a violation of the NEC, but it can also create a number of other problems. Firstly, it can create a fire hazard. If the feeder is damaged or overloaded, it could start a fire. Secondly, it can create an electrical shock hazard. If the feeder is not properly grounded, it could cause an electrical shock. Thirdly, it can create a nuisance for the other tenant. The feeder could be noisy or disruptive. Fourthly, it can reduce the value of the property. A property with a code violation is worth less than a property without a code violation. For all of these reasons, it is important to avoid running a feeder through another tenant's basement. If you are not sure how to properly install a feeder, consult with a qualified electrical contractor. They will be able to help you install the feeder safely and in accordance with all applicable codes and standards. When determining the size of the feeder, you must consider the load it will serve. This includes the lighting, appliances, and other electrical equipment that will be connected to the feeder. The NEC provides tables that specify the minimum size of conductors required for different ampacities. You must also consider the voltage drop. The voltage drop is the amount of voltage that is lost as electricity travels through the conductors. The NEC limits the amount of voltage drop that is allowed. To minimize voltage drop, you should use larger conductors or run the feeder a shorter distance. You must also consider the ambient temperature. The ambient temperature is the temperature of the air surrounding the conductors. The NEC provides tables that specify the ampacity of conductors at different ambient temperatures. If the ambient temperature is high, you may need to use larger conductors to prevent them from overheating. When selecting an overcurrent protection device, you must choose one that is sized appropriately for the ampacity of the conductors. The overcurrent protection device should be located at the source of the feeder, typically at the service disconnect. The overcurrent protection device should be a circuit breaker or a fuse. A circuit breaker is a reusable device that will trip and interrupt the flow of electricity if there is an overload or short circuit. A fuse is a one-time device that will blow and interrupt the flow of electricity if there is an overload or short circuit. When grounding and bonding the feeder, you must follow the requirements of the NEC. The grounding system is designed to provide a path for fault current to flow back to the source. This will help to protect people from electrical shock. The bonding system is designed to connect all of the metal parts of the electrical system together. This will help to prevent voltage differences between the metal parts, which could also cause an electrical shock. The grounding and bonding system must be installed in accordance with the NEC. When installing the feeder, you must use approved wiring methods. The NEC specifies the types of wiring methods that are allowed for different applications. You must also follow the manufacturer's instructions for installing the wiring method. The wiring method must be properly supported and protected from damage. The wiring method must also be installed in a neat and workmanlike manner. When making connections, you must use approved connectors. The connectors must be sized appropriately for the conductors. The connectors must be properly tightened and insulated. The connections must be made in a neat and workmanlike manner. Before putting the feeder into service, you must test it to make sure that it is working properly. You should test the voltage, current, and grounding. You should also test the overcurrent protection device. If the feeder is not working properly, you should not put it into service. You should consult with a qualified electrical contractor to troubleshoot the problem. Running a feeder through another tenant's basement is a serious code violation. It can also create a number of safety hazards. If you are not sure how to properly install a feeder, consult with a qualified electrical contractor. They will be able to help you install the feeder safely and in accordance with all applicable codes and standards.